Welcome. On behalf of Carroll County Public Library, thank you for joining us tonight for 225 years of collaboration and innovation, Reflections on Union Mills Homestead's Anniversary. This is a wonderful partnership event between the library and Union Mills Homestead. It also falls under the county Celebrating America initiative, which we are both proud partners of. Sam Riley is with me right now, and I'm going to turn it over to him in just 1 minute. But a couple of housekeeping things for this evening. We would love to have some audience interaction. So go ahead and place any questions you have for any of our panelists or about the Union Mills Homestead in general. Just go ahead and type it in the comments section, and we will get to as many of those questions as we can this evening. And now, Sam, I pass it over to you.
Thank you, and thank all of you for joining us this evening. A particular thank you to our partner, the Carroll County Public Library, for hosting and streaming this program this evening. We are so happy to present this program in honor of the Union Mills Homestead's 225th anniversary. Union Mills was founded back in 1797, making 2022 the 225th year since two Shriver brothers built the house and the mill at Union Mills. I should note that the type of collaboration that went into this program reflects much of the history of the site, making this broadcast particularly meaningful. I would ordinarily introduce our panelists, but we'll let them do so themselves in the course of the program that follows. Be sure to stay online for the panel discussion after the pre-recorded program of the tonight's programming. And thanks again to all of you. And without further ado, here's the start of our program.
The very interesting thing about Union Mills, it's of course in Carroll County, and it's been around since the inception of our country, and back when George Washington was president. And so a time of great importance to our country, a time of a lot of change. And so those things that the founders of Union Mills experienced have a very important lesson for us today.
Well, Union Mills began as a partnership with David and Andrew Shriver, looking for a place where they could operate a business. They built a mill here, a sawmill, and they chose the name Union Mills because of the business enterprises that they started and the partnership of the two brothers.
Always interesting when brothers partner, because brothers, even though they're from the same family, are often quite different. But many times brothers bring those skills that the other one lacks, and resources and connections and networking that can then create something more than that did not exist before. And so you see the Union Mills, the forming of two mills, if you will, in one economic operation, expanded the opportunities for the whole community.
The house itself was a double house, and it was built for both Andrew and David Shriver. Later, David became superintendent for building the National Road and left, and he sold his partnership out to Andrew Shriver, whose family remained here. Andrew's family grew. He had 11 children with his wife Elizabeth, and the 6 rooms they started with in that double house ended up growing to 23. Then over generations, different family members have lived here, as many generations, both grandparents, aunts, uncles, even orphan children came to live with their grandparents at Union Mills. And that multi-generation, the multi-family aspect of Union Mills carried up probably right up into the final days when 3 brothers ended up as inheriting the homestead in 1957.
One of the neat things about the homestead is it's not just a house, it was a home. It was a home for a family, 6 generations. It was 160 years permanently occupied, and all its furnishings are there. It was a home. A family lived here. A family built it. It's just like a family walked right out of it. But when you walk in, it's as if you're just in a house and you're welcome to visit.
An operation like Union Mills, it was very the center of community. Very important that people depended on each other. Farmers were doing their thing, but they came then to Union Mills with their grain, needed that service, and then it became a hub, and relationships developed because of that.
I think what really makes the Union Mills homestead unique is its business enterprises, starting with a mill, a sawmill. They had a cooper shop to build the barrels to ship the grain through the port of Baltimore. They had a blacksmith shop for repairing ironwork and farm tools. They built the tannery that gave them income from processing leather. And they also kept modernizing the enterprises. They added steam boilers to the tannery. They changed the mill from a wooden geared operation to metal turbines so they could operate year-round. So they're always inventive and growing and modernizing the site, and also led them into the canning industry.
I can only imagine the importance, the dependence that people had on each other to survive, to raise food, to bring it to market, to share it with others, and have the advantages that a market system could bring. So the development of those business relationships and that community, that raised the standard of living. We're living the fruits of that. Began back at a place like the Homestead and repeated other places around. But at the Homestead, this was a way of life that went on for many generations, and those partnerships built and expanded beyond grain to tannery, to leather goods, to other areas and opportunities. So as the world changed, so did the Homestead, and so that history of change, that those business opportunities were a lesson for us of how partnership helps you build, that fills in the gaps that you need to improve, to make improvements, to take advantage of technology.
Well, it was a gathering place, of course, because of all the business and everything. But with the family, you have social events. And I think one of the interesting things is the parlor, where we welcome our visitors when they come to visit, is a place that after church on Sunday, the family would gather. You would celebrate birthdays, you would celebrate anniversaries, weddings, and all types of a thing that a family has. A home is a gathering place. And it's interesting to find how much gathering went on here. Large families, but relatives would come and visit. All kinds of activities went on. This place was alive, and alive as a home should be.
Throughout that time, the family stayed close. They did become divided at politics at the Civil War, part of the family becoming strong Union supporters, the other side becoming strong Southern supporters. That period of time had heated arguments, differences of opinions, but they grew back together in the years following, attending their daughters' weddings and socializing and rejoining in that effort of friendship, partnership, and business working together.
I represent the 6th generation of the Shriver clan to have occupied the homestead. My father was Philip Shriver Klein, and he and his brothers, Fred and Richard, came into ownership of the homestead in 1950. Did spend a week or two every summer there from the early 50s through the mid-60s. My grandmother, Winifred Shriver, one of the last kids to grow up in the homestead, I never really knew. She died when I was still an infant. Her sister, Bessie, who did live at the homestead her entire life, I did know. She died in 1957, just short of her 88th birthday. While she was alive, every visit of ours to the homestead included an audience with Aunt Bessie. She lived in her side of the house. We stayed on Uncle Lou's side. At the appointed time, we would go to her door, be escorted into the front parlor. She would usually be on the couch. We would sit rather stiffly on chairs. I honestly don't recall the conversations very well, but I know that she was very old. I was very young. I had been told to be on my best behavior. And frankly, she scared me just a little bit.
We played everywhere and had so much fun. We went over to Cousin Lou's. We played over in Cousin Lou's barn. We played in Cousin Lou's, or maybe it wasn't Cousin Lou's, but a mill. But we played in the mill. We often saw Cousin Lou walking back and forth. I'm not sure he always approved of us. We were little, and we got in a lot of mischief. Cousin Lou would walk over to the mill, and he would go in, and there were always farmers sitting in that little office. They had the most wonderful stove in there that they burned all year round. And they all sit around in the stove talking. And I think that was Cousin Lou's way of keeping up with everything in the community. But he sat there and talked to all the farmers. And the farmers sat there while the miller was taking care of their orders.
There were a lot of events that I recall happening at Union Mills while I was there. From informal picnics down on the Bowman Bridge when it still went over Pipe Creek, to in 1957, a formal dinner party in celebration of my Uncle Fred and Aunt Florence's 25th wedding anniversary.
And the small rural community of Union Mills kind of wound down, and the site itself became more of a keeper of the family traditions than as a growing progressive enterprise that it had been through the early generations.
My Uncle Fred was a Civil War buff, and this gave him the idea, because of Union Mills' role in the Civil War, to create it as an attraction during the Civil War centennial, to make the most of the public's renewed interest in that period of American history. So along with fixing up the house for tours, he created a small Civil War museum in the mill on the first floor. This was before the mill machinery had been restored to working order.
Growing up as a youngster in Carroll County, I saw this homestead as sort of being simply associated with the Civil War. And it was a very interesting story and kept my interest for many years, still does. But the homestead is really not limited to that Civil War history. History of the mill, the history of the tannery are all great stories. That sort of early industrial complex being a center. And you know, Carroll County had many little centers of industry, if you will. The wonderful thing about Union Mills Homestead is that's still there and still captured, and it's a great treasure for us and for future historians to mine, to learn more, to bring out the stories that we don't even know are there. They just need to be uncovered.
As the idea of Union Mills as a tourist destination started catching on, the Klein brothers realized that they needed help. They could not do it all alone. So in the mid-1960s, they created the Union Mills Homestead Foundation to share the burden. And I've got to say, I'm absolutely thrilled and amazed, as would they be, that here we are 65 years after the last full-time resident died, and the mills is thriving.
We sometimes think about a home and we think about all the chores and all the things you did, but there were celebrations. There were wonderful family things, and luckily we have pictures. One thing was a summer frolic, corn frolic. They had a picnic when the corn was coming in, and one of our events, the corn roast, is reflecting that type of thing that the family actually did here. I think a corn roast and watermelon frolic. but the family celebrated. There were birthdays, Christmas. Our Christkindlmarkt reflects the German heritage of the family, and that some of the customs that would have been done here for Christmas time, and what the family had. We have some artifacts and things that the family gifts they had, a sled, a particular story about Christmas at the homestead that was written for one of the children that we have to tell about those things. So life was, yes, every day, but it was also very special occasions. And that is really what people treasure, is spending those family times together. And the homestead provided that for a family.
In 1997, when I wrote the bicentennial chapter to my Uncle Fred's 1957 essay about Union Mills, the so-called Red Book, I quoted Fred's conclusion, which said, "How long can the old homestead and the mill further withstand age, time, and weather?" Well, we've made it 65 years now, but the homestead and the mill are exceedingly fragile, and Fred's question remains a challenge. I love that the story of Union Mills has been a story of partnerships, that at the beginning, Andrew and David started us off in 1797. In the mid-1800s, two brothers, Andrew K. and William, ran separate parts of the business next to one another. By the 1940s, two aging sisters ended up owning the homestead. And then in the 1950s, three brothers, Richard, Frederick, and Philip, wanted to share the history that the place holds. The Klein brothers created a foundation that could use the site and the Shriver story to teach that history. And now, an astounding 225 years later, there's a whole network of family and friends keeping Union Mills alive. The foundation and the county work together in a partnership, as the property is owned by the county but operated by the foundation. This history of collaboration is the key part of the Union Mills story. So I just want to say, on behalf of the 6 generations past and all those who will follow, thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed our 225th anniversary video. But now is an exciting time for you to be a part of the discussion tonight and ask your questions that you have of the panelists. Those questions can be entered into the comment section on your computer. My name is Tony Eckert. I'm a board member from Union Mills Homestead. I also serve as the library's director of finance. So I have a dual role here tonight, library and Homestead. And it's my honor to be your facilitator for tonight for the discussion. I'd like for each, as we wait for questions to come in from our audience, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to give us an introduction and then we'll get into the questions and answers. So Jim, can you lead us off, please?
Oh, certainly. I'm very happy to join the group tonight. I'm James Shriver. I'm a 6th generation family member, descended from Andrew and Elizabeth. My ancestor, William, was the one who operated the mill after the family divided the property. And I'm looking forward to questions that you may have about the enterprise. I'm also a Union Mills native, having grown up right here in Union Mills.
And Jane, will you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Jane Sharp. I'm a Union Mills native, as James. Also, I'm a member of the Board of Governors and a retired librarian from McDaniel College. And I have had the privilege of being a docent guide at the Homestead for many years and work with training guides for the Homestead and doing a lot of volunteer activities. And I think it's one of the most special historic homesteads that there is. And lots of reasons for that. And maybe some of your questions will help me share some of that information with you.
Good. Thanks, Jane. And Doug, I just have to comment. I can relate to that feeling of being a little bit afraid of grandmother when you were sitting there. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Doug Klein. I'm the son of Philip Klein and nephew of Fred and Richard. And my ancestor is A.K. Shriver, Jim's ancestor's brother. And A.K. ran the tannery side of the business starting in the 1850s on.
Very good. Well, as we wait for some questions to come in, I have maybe a little surprise. Back when I was a mere 7 years old, my mom insisted that, well, not insisted, did, my mom says, you're going. And she took me to Union Mills. And I don't know if you can see this as a copy signed by your uncle, just south of Gettysburg. And I think that was when that book was released. And so he signed it 59 years ago. And again, I was 7 years old. My older brother, was very much interested in Civil War history. And so as the little brother, I just came along for the ride on many things. But that began my understanding of Union Mills. And I saw it primarily as a Civil War site, and its relationship to Gettysburg. But interesting thing, as my life has gone on, and I have been able to visit historical sites like Union Mills and others over time, my knowledge changes. I maybe in between a visit, I read a book or I hear a podcast, and then I change. When I go back, I see it differently. And so, Doug, I'd like to sort of throw this out to you as, from your background and all. How have you seen, how has your impressions and perspectives of Union Mills changed over the years?
Well, that's a great question. Before I start, I have to say I love that Jane was on the rocking chair on the front porch for her interviews for the video. Because whenever we go down and visit, the first thing we do is make a beeline for the rocking chairs, take each other's pictures on the rocking chairs, because that was the place to hang out while you were there. Obviously, so I was born in 1948. So my father and his brothers started working on the enterprise in 1950, and I was very young then. So my firsthand recollections of the earliest years are not all that great, except for roaming the attics, roaming the forbidden buildings, and all that sort of thing that a kid's going to do. I mean, the attics were especially fascinating to me. I don't think anybody, I know nobody had tried to sort anything in the attic for 100 years. So I think my uncle Fred estimated that 50 adults had lived in the house, and each one of them just kept shoving stuff in the attic, and the attics just seemed to be endless. It's a miracle that the newspapers and magazines didn't self-combust up there, piled from floor to ceiling as they were. But the only thing I remember especially being warned about was the fact that there is a trap door at the upper end of the main staircase. So if you go upstairs, on the second floor, there's stairs that goes up and just hits the ceiling. And I was told if you stand there, you'll fall through. So I was very nervous about getting too close to that, because there wasn't much room to navigate around it either, because stuff was just piled everywhere. But like you, Tony, as I've gotten older, I've realized that there's a lot to the story. In fact, my Uncle Fred said history is made of three things. It's made of artifacts and materials left over. And then it's made of archives and the paper record that people left. Then it's made of stories, just the memories that people have. And as I've gotten older, it's kind of sobering for me to realize that those of us who have firsthand memories of what it was like before it came a museum, as it were, are dwindling. And so there's going to be an increased reliance on the other two things to create the history. I guess I'll just also add that, so my father was an American historian specializing on Pennsylvania history, and he actually wrote a biography of James Buchanan and sort of defended James Buchanan. And my uncle Fred was also an American historian, specializing on Civil War history. And my other uncle Richard was not an historian, but he was a lawyer, and he's the one that sort of tried to keep the other two brothers honest as they developed the foundation. But yeah, I think that Fred, especially, his focus in the late 50s and early 60s was on capturing the Civil War enthusiasm, people who wanted to learn more about it. But I think all of them, especially the two historians, my father and my uncle, grew in the appreciation of the historical time capsule that the foundation was.
That's wonderful, Doug. I'm glad you picked up on on Jane enjoying the rocking chair. As a youth, whenever I would visit anyone, if there was a rocking chair, that's where I made a beeline. And so, Jane, in the video, you really stressed the importance of the homestead as a home, as a gathering place, and the rocking chair is probably a perfect symbol of that. What can you tell us about the artifacts and I'll say the treasures that are at Union Mills that are available for people to visit and see?
I think one of the most important things is that I was just talking with somebody about the importance of primary resources. Union Mills is a primary resource. It's the artifacts as well as the written word that we have diaries, we have letters, we have photographs. A lot of museums do not have that rich background. And so we can show it to people when they come to visit this house. They see the things. We did not have to collect and borrow. I was just reading about a museum in New England, and they talk about, well, we went out and we collected and we borrowed. We have it at the homestead. We have all these rich resources. When we talk about Civil War history, and one of my goals is we have 225 years of history to tell. We have history of males who worked there and females who lived there and raised families together. And the fact that we are beginning to do some digitalization so we can share those resources. You can come and visit it. You can come and sit on a rocker on that front porch. You can walk in and see as if the family just walked out. You can see the needs, the things the daily life. And you can read about it. We know what happened there during the Civil War time. There's a diary that's somewhat, and I think a lot of museums do not have that materials to go on. And I think when you walk through and see the objects and you think about culture, aesthetics, all those aspects, our industrial aspect is very important, and there's lots of facets to that. But I think the home is too. I mean, people needed a place to live, a place to raise their children, educate them, celebrate. Like I said in the previous video, there were many Christmases there in 225 years, many birthdays, many births, many baptisms, many deaths. And all these things we can touch and we can turn that into our interpretation. We have provenance. If you ever watch Antiques Roadshow, how important it is. Well, where did you get it? What did you do it? We have some records about maybe an article when it was bought, who used it, how it was used. It's so interesting to work with children and take them into our kitchen and say, okay, did you want to eat in the wintertime? Well, you had to do some food preparation. You didn't run out to the store or have an Amazon box on your front porch or fresh food or something like that. You had to dry apples. They love to work the coffee grinder when they come in, and we have coffee beans. Sometimes we can let the children do that. I mean, the grain, like the story of the little red hen, the grain came to the mill was milled, but you had to bake it into bread. We have so many areas of interpretation we can make with history, gender roles. And one of my ideas is we cannot forget the ladies. And some of the other periods of history that we need to focus on. We are an important early American industrial complex. And when you think about a mill, what did you need in a mill? You needed leather belts to run the mill, so a tannery. Barrels, as James said, to ship the flour, leather for the horses, and so blacksmith shop, tanneries, and other things like that. We just have so much to offer, and we have so much to support our interpretation. And we can focus on a family and a way of life, and I think we all can identify with that.
Thank you, Jane. We have an audience question, and it involves the cannery. And I'd like to kind of expand on that. Geography is a very important characteristic of the success of the Homestead and Union Mills, and um, and I really don't know much about the history of the cannery, and I guess that translates into the B.F. Shriver Company. And so, James, I'll direct this question to you. What can you tell us about the cannery, the relationship of Union Mills and Silver Run, and the significance of location on Big Pipe Creek?
Oh, certainly, I'd be happy to. What's fascinating about the canning industry, that my great grandfather entered it. He had his brother, another Andrew K. Shriver, often called Uncle Kai, invented the Shriver retort, which was a pressure cooker that allowed you to modernize and process canned goods. So my great grandfather started up a canning operation in the cooper shop directly behind the mill. And what was interesting, the water from the mill race would cool the canning operation after you took the cans out of the retort. And that business grew, and he built his own plant along the tail race opposite Pipe Creek near the bridge. So if you're traveling down 97, on the left-hand side, there's a spur that looks like a concrete pad. That was the entrance to where the original canning factory was placed. And they placed it along the mill race, again, to utilize the water to cool the cans after they came out of the retorts. And they had a large warehouse there. And that canning factory ran right up and probably to the 1930s. And then they added 6 other canneries around Carroll County. Now, Carroll County was a pioneer in the canning industry. There were small canneries throughout. Competitors in Silver Run, many people will remember the A.W. Feeser Canning Company, and the Feeser House sits prominently in the center of Silver Run. Maryland itself had 600 vegetable canning operations, oyster canning, and seafood canning operations itself. The largest number of canneries in the United States up until the 1930s, and California took over for having the most canneries.
Very, very interesting. And the enterprise sort of expanded. Did the B.F. Shriver Company ever sort of headquarter in Westminster?
Oh, yes. The original office was in Union Mills. And at that time, my great grandfather said he needed better communications. So he ran his own phone lines because he said he needed telephonic communications to stay modern. And eventually, they moved to Westminster because of the rail line. And they built their cannery along the railroad so that they could get shipments of cans for the factory and also ship finished product from the rail. So that factory still exists. And of course, the railroad line is Railroad Avenue.
Very interesting.
And there was an office where the old post office sat in downtown Main Street. And then the later office was put, it's a white building with a brownstone arch that says Shriver Building. It still exists.
I think that's one of the things so interesting about the I'll say the sphere of influence of Union Mills is it's not just that location, but it impacted the whole county, and was a major economic driver for the county.
A lot of people don't realize Union Mills was a crossroad settlement. One time, the road to Manchester Hampstead went by, the road to Hanover, and of course, the Reisterstown Turnpike connected Baltimore to Gettysburg in the west. So it was a very prime location as far as transportation.
It's also why Union Mills remained a post office for so long. It was the hub of the rural free delivery system, and we have lots of envelopes to and from Union Mills, because not only did the residents not throw away the letters, they didn't throw away the envelopes either. And you can look at the post office, the postmarks, and see letters could be delivered on the same day. It would be delivered sent in the morning from Union Mills, delivered in someplace like York that same afternoon.
I don't want to make disparaging comments, but I don't see that happening today.
No, I don't either.
But technology is really another thread through the history of the site, and the Oliver Evans mill that is the grist mill was new technology. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that allowed for one person to really operate the machinery that milled the grain. And as as we and in future generations observe that I think we kind of can be humbled by the fact that great things of technology, great things, achievements of people happened before we came along. I mean, we're so sort of numb to the change of technology. But Doug, when you were there, what was the nature of the mill operation?
Well, I put a picture up behind my head, which sort of shows you the state of the mill. It didn't have any windows. It didn't have any doors. It didn't have very much machinery. It certainly had no operating machinery. And the mill race was dry as a bone. It had weeds and bushes growing in it. And I don't think Fred had any vision of the mill ever operating again, but he was convinced that he had to have water back in the mill race. So he spent years during the mid-1950s trying to dredge. And Jim, I don't know whether you remember this or not, but he called in outside excavators, and he got more bulldozers stuck in the race as water leaked in, and then the bulldozers would get stuck, and they'd bring in another bulldozer to pull the first bulldozer out. But he did finally get water there, and then he just, in order to sort of symbolically represent what the mill had been, he got a little wheel about 4 feet in diameter and set it up at the bottom of the trough, and it just spun around doing absolutely nothing. But it was his way of acknowledging what had been there once. And the fact that there's a full-size water wheel there now and turning millstones is absolutely astonishing. And it's to my mind, I'm kind of a technophile. It's really a highlight of a trip there to see that mill in operation. But
growing up while the mill was idle, the mill dam actually served as the best swimming hole in the community, and everyone would gather on Deep Run Road to swim in Pipe Creek above the mill dam.
Mm-hmm.
Well, certainly great memories there. Jim, can you tell us a little bit about the World's Fair in Philadelphia and its tie to the tannery?
I didn't realize you'd been there, Jim.
Well, I didn't make it that year, but what's fascinating about World's Fair is that 1876 exposition was America's first opportunity to host a World's Fair, and it also celebrated our independence year of 100 years later. And all over America, industry sent products to be exhibited, and the Homestead sent leather. And the leather that the Homestead sent won awards. We won awards for oak sole leather, and we have the certificate and the medals from that 1876 World's Fair. And then in the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, which actually commemorated Lewis and Clark in the Louisiana Purchase, the B.F. Shriver Company entered canned goods and won awards for canned goods at that World's Fair. So World's Fairs were good to Union Mills because at both times they won awards.
And if I can go back to something that Jane said a little while ago in terms of having the documentation to back some of this up, Louis Shriver was kind of the record keeper for the tannery side of the business. And he kept copybooks, which were tissue paper books. When he would write a letter, he would wet the tissue paper, put it over the letter he'd written, and then put it through a letter press, and it would make a facsimile of the letter on the tissue paper. So we have lots of his correspondence with hide dealers out in the West. So we know who he bought from, how much he bought, when he bought it, and also correspondence with bark sellers and what kind of bark he was buying and for what prices. So all the business documents around that business exist. I suspect for the cannery as well, there are similar documentation.
Well, that leads me to a question for Jane. Jane, with your experience and as an interpreter of the Shriver Homestead history, what can you tell us about what Doug just mentioned, this documentary evidence and stories that maybe we don't know are there, but are maybe yet to be told?
And I'm glad you said that, Tony, because lots of people will say, well, I've been there, done that, had the tour. The tour, yes, basically is, but we're always learning new facts, new information all the time, new ways of interpreting and things like that. And having this primary resource, I feel very comfortable as a docent telling people things that happened there because it actually did. There are letters from that Civil War period. There is a diary. The tannery records of purchases. The piano in the parlor was bought in 1863. We know how much they paid for it, how it came in a wagon. In the middle of the Civil War, a piano was purchased for the parlor. I mean, we call it the dance hall in that particular room that time. But it's very important to me for interpretation. We don't make our stories up. And there have been stories that have been changed because of research that we've done. There is a particular light fixture that's in the dining room. And they always said that Bessie had purchased it at a sale at the church in Silver Run. There are two churches in Silver Run. I go to one of them and I thought, I have never seen anything like that, in the church. Well, I went back and looked at some of the pictorial records. And sure enough, those light fixtures were there. She purchased it. There's probably a record of the purchase, and it was electrified, and it hangs in the dining room at the homestead. So we can feel comfortable telling those stories and interpreting them, interpreting purchases and what were there. I love interpreting the toys and about the gender roles of children and the things that went on there. We are so fortunate. I think other museums, I'm sure they have to make things up. I'm very particular that we don't make things up because we don't have to. Because of the richness of having those resources, I think we're, as stewards of the homestead and our artifacts and the resources that we have, we're going to be sharing a lot more of that with the historians and people of interest in the world. And that, I think, is part of our job to do also, to tell our story of a family and stories of actually what went on there. And to have those artifacts, to be able to show a doll that is made with leather that was tanned in the tannery. I'm learning more about the tannery every year as we do archaeological research. We'll be doing more interpretation of that particular aspect. I still have a lot to learn about milling too. I learn something new every time I go through. We try to work with our guides and docents to share that thing. And one of the things, Tony, we didn't talk about was the German-American aspect. The family originally from Germany, Alstenborn, Germany, and settled here, as many families in this particular area of lower Pennsylvania, upper Maryland. And the homestead played a really important role lots of times of interpreting for those German settlers, bringing letters there, bringing politicians to speak and interpreting those speeches into the language that people could understand. That's a tremendous fact, I think, that we don't think about, the immigration aspect, that we have things to tell. We have so many stories to tell, and in so many aspects, cultural, industry, even aesthetics, having a lovely garden. Well, when did you have time in making a living, running an industry, and having time to make a beautiful garden, not just for vegetables that you needed to eat, but something you could aesthetically sit on a porch in a rocking chair and enjoy. And we have a wonderful story, you'll have to come hear it, about there was some letters. We have actual letters that talk about someone who sat on that porch in a rocking chair and didn't appreciate looking across and seeing that decrepit mill across from them, and suggested it should be torn down. It wasn't.
I just want to go back and pick up on something Jane said about the genuine artifacts in the house. As a kid, I loved the toy room, or I think it's called the post office room now, but it has the shelf of toys because I played with those toys. Nobody told me not to play with them, and I don't think I broke very many. I don't think I broke any of them. But as an adult, I was on a tour just because I wasn't allowed to wander through by myself anymore. And I don't know whether you may even have been the docent, I know, but we got to that room and somebody else on the tour said, "What's that?" And the person leading said, "I don't really know." And I said, I reached for it. I said, "I can show you what that does." And the person said, "You're not supposed to touch." I said, "Look, I grew up here. I know what it is. It was a little metal box. You crank the side and it plays little chords. It's a little chord organ." And so I got to demonstrate it, but I don't think she liked having the audience touching the merchandise.
But that's a beauty too of our tour, Tony, that you can walk through. Our rooms are not roped off, as many museums are. We do give personal tours. We have guides that do that. You can walk through and imagine being there.
Yeah, we're not a museum under glass. So you have a chance to feel like you're in a home, and it's multi-generational, so that you get a feeling for what each generation, how they lived and how they passed it on to the next generation. And the artifacts are not just pieces of, they're actually a story to tell. Each artifact, many of them have a special story behind them.
Yeah, my uncle wrote a lot of sort of publicity pieces in the late 50s and early 60s as he and his brothers were trying to figure out how to turn this into a public museum or historical site. And they debated whether to try to make period rooms represent different eras in history. And they decided no, they wanted it to look as much like it looked like when people lived there as possible. And again, since Lou and Bessie lived there into their 80s in the case of Bessie and 90s in the case of Lou, they pretty much stayed in their one or two rooms, and the other 30 odd rooms just stayed untouched for many decades in the early part of the 20th century. And that's the way the brothers decided to leave it. Just leave it, try to weed out the true junk, but leave the things as they lay, as it were.
And actually, I think that they had the right idea, because we have so many people compliment that they enjoy a tour at the Homestead for that reason, that they enjoy what I call the early American clutter. Drives curators crazy because we do have multi periods, eras combined, but it's the way the family lived.
Well, I think this has been changed a little bit. Back in the 50s when I went there were 3 kitchens in the structure. There's the old kitchen, which looks now pretty much like it did then. Nobody did anything in the old kitchen except hang up all the odds and ends of old equipment. Then there was Lou's kitchen, which is I think what's now called the bicycle room. It's just outside the old kitchen, and he had about a late 20s or early 30s kitchen there. It was an electric stove, but a really funky old electric stove, and a tiny little electric ice box, and a true farm sink that just sat by itself on 4 posts. And then Bessie's kitchen was somewhere in between. Hers was about a 1900 kitchen, I would say. It had a wood-burning stove. You had to use a special tool to lift up the burners and chuck the wood in. And even after she died, that kitchen stayed for a few years anyway, because I can remember feeding the stove in the morning.
Great thoughts and great memories. Jane, I want to pick up on something that you mentioned. And in the interpretation, so there's the industrial side, there's the home side, there's the Civil War side. The importance of interpretation and interpreting, I'll say, the whole complex. That there's a I'm searching for a word, but there's sort of a holistic type of approach that I think is very important for our local community to know and appreciate, uh, as a sort of a genuineness. We heard this in our long range planning focus groups, that there's a certain affection, if you will, for the community, for our site, because of this authenticity. Could you expound upon that?
I think you said the correct. In fact, I had a few notes just in case I needed to prompt myself tonight. And my very first word is authenticity. Like I said, a lot of museums, I was reading about this one in New England, and it said we had to borrow and collect. They had to create these things. We have a mill. We've gone out and we've researched. We've luckily had support from our county and national and grants and everything to recreate this, but we had to have, as good stewards, take that vision and come forward with it. This, like James mentioned, the roads that came in there. I mean, people do not realize this was a crossroads. This was a busy early, I know when we used to say that in our interpretation, an early American industrial complex, and people kind of looked at you, okay, yeah, what, here, this dead little place out here, and some people think in the middle of nowhere, but 97 is a very busy road. There's just so much to interpret and to share that story and to treasure that story, where we came from. We talk about how we're such a disposable society, talking to the children, how these things lasted. And if you were tired of them or a new artifact or something came out, you didn't throw it away. You repurposed it or put it in the attic, as Doug would say. You stored it away. A different way of looking at society, which of course we're thinking of upcycling now and doing things like that, and reinterpreting and really looking at this, where society has come from, and appreciating it and learning from it, how these partnerships, how working together, how a community worked together and did these things. I mean, I've been amazed because I've been learning more every time I'm here and I try to put something into it. I did not know our flour was sent to Europe. Okay, James, important, the railroad, important wagons to Baltimore, that Union Mills, Carroll County flour was put in barrels and sent to France. Amazing to me. And I think we have a duty to share that and to show we're not just an old house with a mill. We are so much more. We are just a snapshot of American history, and we have a lot to share and interpret. I hope that answers your question, Tony.
It really does, and it helps, certainly all generations, and I mean living generations, baby boomers, millennials, etc., to gain understanding of where we've come from as a country, as a county. So, Jane, could you say add a little bit about the African American experience? Can you speak to that?
This is one of the areas, along with, like, I'm always waving the flag to talk about the ladies of the homestead, the women. They have a story to tell, and that we've told about it. Some of them, Bessie and Winifred, it certainly was important. But there are other aspects of the labor at the homestead. I mean, we've talked about farmers bringing things. We did have enslaved people at the homestead. I think on one of our walls is an indentured servants document. So I think the labor picture of early American society on through the Civil War period, of looking at enslaved people, looking at indentured servants, looking at people coming in and working for these industries that were there. And they were industries. They weren't just little shops. They were industries. And I think this is an important part of our history. And we do mention that we have a poster for a runaway slave, and to read it carefully. We did have enslaved people in a family that did not support the Confederate side of the world, but had slaves. I mean, this is an important part of our story. And I think the reason we have to take time to do it right we have to interpret it. We want to know more about Ruth and her family. We have names, we know where they lived, we know important roles that they had at the homestead. And I think this is something that we're not going to just do a broad brush over. We're going to be documenting, we're going to do documenting, we're going to do research, and we're going to get it right. And we hope to interpret that more and bring that into our story, because it is part of our story. And it's more to our story than we realize, and or I won't say realize, that we've always interpreted. And so this is an aspect that we will be addressing. And so we'll enrich the story that we have to tell.
So if you look at the little book that Lou Shriver wrote back in the 1920s or 30s called Random Shots at Old Times, he has a chapter about his relationship with the Doors, who were the enslaved people who lived there before the war, and then they were freed and continued to live there for a few more years before they moved on.
And we know we did not have slave quarters, where there are some places in Carroll County that actually, they're no longer there, they've been destroyed, but that actually had slave quarters. This family lived in the house with the family. So, I mean, we have an important role here to interpret, and we need to get it right, and we plan to get it right.
Thank you. James, do you have anything to add to that thought?
Yeah, I think that the aspect of labor for all those industries is important, how the homestead sat in the community. And when we talk about the enslaved labor, they were household servants for the home as opposed to working in the industry. And they were a family. And it was a difficult time, but it also was a very complex time when we had a family that were Union supporters, owning slaves, cousins who were Southern sympathizers, not owning slaves, and a very complex issue of slavery and state rights and the Union, and how our country was going to make a turning point at a crossroads in our history. And what I often tell people about Union Mills is they argued, they discussed the issue, but then one day the actual war wound up on the front steps when the Confederate cavalrymen arrived, and then the Union infantrymen, and then they could hear the cannon at Gettysburg, and they could see the wounded being transported to Westminster, and the prisoners being marched by. So it's interesting in history where you talk about politics, you argue about politics, but then it shows up on your doorstep. It really brings a different aspect to it.
Thank you. We have time, just a little bit more time left. Doug, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have any sort of final thoughts, wrap up for our audience tonight?
I'll just say that reflecting on the conversation we just had, I don't want to say that divisions heal slowly, but back when I was a kid, I didn't have a lot of conversations. I mean, Jim, you and I are not that far apart in age, but I didn't spend time with you in the 1950s. I think I might have visited your dad as a courtesy call once or twice in those years. But it makes me extremely happy to see your involvement, to see the broader Shriver family involvement in all this from both sides of the road. It's partly I'm glad because my side of the road doesn't have many people left. But apart from that, I'm really happy that we're all in this together now. So that's a wonderful sort of moral to the story, or ending to the story, or continuation of the story, I should say.
No, you're seeing a reuniting of the
there you go, exactly,
and the northern side of the family.
I think we would coin that a union.
There we go.
Well, it's been delightful having this conversation with all of you tonight, and thanks the audience for viewing our program. And I'll turn it over to Sam for final comments.
Mute.
Sorry about that. I was trying to be a good participant and have myself muted when I was supposed to be. Tony, thank you so much for for moderating this evening. Thanks again to all of our panelists and to the Carroll County Public Library. There are so many thank yous that we could make for this evening, and it would frankly take way too much time. But I did want to make a shout out to Reed Parkins for filming and editing the opening sequence for that pre-recorded portion that was filmed there at Union Mills. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we hope that you come to visit us. Our hours are on the unionmills.org website. You can check that out at any time. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that our next big event is the Maryland Microbrewery Festival, which is on Saturday, September 24th. We hope to see you then. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'll say farewell this evening.